Hello. I've started to do these thematic approaches to the Iliad. I will at some point get to book 12 in the Aeneid, um, but as Casper was the only one that got back to me, I know Josie got back to Miss Havoc, and it got back to me, but this is going to be quicker and easier. So anyway, gods and fate in the Iliad. This sort of covers two separate things. So in your specification, there are two separate bullet points on the power of fate and the role of the immortals there. That's taken straight from the specification. Back in 2019, there was a 30 marker on the gods and the extent to which they're depicted as human. Last year, the Aeneid 30 marker was on fate and the gods. Was it? Women, gods, and goddesses? Yep. I'm going to assume that OCR were lazy enough to sort of stick with the same theme for the next year for the Iliads, and it's not come up yet. Fate has not come up, and even though it's my least favourite topic, and I would always recommend to answer the other question, I'm going to give you a quick rundown of fate and the gods, and how to approach some of the arguments about gods and fate if it does come up. But this is not a sort of detailed essay plan. You would still need to go away and find some more examples and obviously answer the goddamn question. So the highest level essays always contemplate the poem as a piece of art. Okay, and they could think about the artist's intentions and what the function of each entity and character and theme is. So the women as a function, war as a function, how does it work within the piece of art? So E.V. Ryu, the scholar that's in the introduction of your 1950s edition, he argues that the Greeks considered Homer to be the first theologian. What does that mean? First theologian. So the first man who gave the gods sort of function and personality and a sort of mandate as to how they act. So Ryu understood it as if the Greeks were almost reading the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Homeric poems as like a Bible, where they were sort of saying, this is how the gods act, this is how we understand them to behave and what they like and what they don't like. And look, we can see that to some extent in the way that like the humans worship the gods, for example, the Trojans in Book 6 when they pray to Athena, the way that they sort of prepare Patroclus's body to go down to the underworld, all of that, that seems sort of realistic in terms of the relationship between the mortals and the gods. But I would always side more with this guy Jenkins, who argues against Ryu. So remember, you could use him as battle of the scholars. So Jenkins says Homer uses the gods and fate purely for emotional and literary effects. That's how they sort of function within the narrative. They're simply poetic devices. They are employed to evoke emotion from the audience, and that's pretty much it. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Let's look at it in two different ways. This is not an exhaustive list of the function of the gods and fate, and certainly focuses more on the gods. So obviously we can see that the gods, they're often used for sort of light entertainment, a bit of respite, give the audience room to breathe between the scenes of the fighting. And we can see this in lots of different ways when they act like a bickering family, like the banquet in Book 1, where Hephaestus calms down Zeus and Hera's arguing, and they all just laugh at Hephaestus because he's disabled, and that's hilarious, apparently. We see it with Zeus winding up Hera and Athena in Book 4. So in Book 4, he says, "Shall we stir up evil war again?" And lots of people point to that as this, like, oh, Zeus was considering in Book 4 ending the war. No, he wasn't. Before he starts speaking, he eyes up these two women and wants to needle them, I think is what it says in your translation. And needling someone is like poking them, winding them up. And so he's saying that just to wind them up, this idea that he might end the war. He was never planning on ending the war, essentially. And we see that Hera seduces Zeus in Book 15 as well, for example. We can find it quite entertaining that they are so heavily involved in the funeral games in Book 23, as involved as they are in the battle scenes, for example. And we can see that the decisions and the actions of the gods, in particular Zeus, they are there to create drama and intrigue for the audience, such as when he holds up the scales, for example, to see who ought to die in Book 22. So all of these things, and I'm sure you can now go away, and I would suggest perhaps pausing it, going away, looking back at your poem. What examples can you add to this? Are ways in which the gods and fate function within the narrative. And another way in which the gods and fate function is to create this tragic irony. This is where we get that they sort of evoke these emotions. This is particularly keen with Zeus, whose role is used to create tragic irony, particularly when it comes to foretelling the death of mortals, which is sort of where we see him taking on a leading role in his interactions with fate. So we see it, Patroclus' death is foretold in book 8. We then get further details in book 15 when we find out that actually Hector's one's going to kill him and then Hector's going to die. So obviously Patroclus' death foretold in book 8. He doesn't die until book 16. Hector's death, foretold in book 15, doesn't die until book 22. So there's then huge swathes of the poem in which these mortals are acting and interacting with other mortals, and us as an audience, we know that they're going to die, and so there's this heightened effect, such as when, Achilles then in book 16 bids farewell to Patroclus and is like, see you soon, mate. We're all like, no, you'll never see him soon. And when we see Hector in book 18 deciding to stay outside the walls and deciding to convince all of the Trojans to stay outside the walls, and we're thinking, no, don't do that, you're going to die. So it's in lots of different ways, this heightens our engagement as an audience with the poem, and that's the way that the gods and fate, so Zeus proclaiming what fate is telling him about these mortals, it heightens our emotional engagement with the poem. And we see that Zeus sort of has to grapple the most out of all of the gods with fate. We see him deciding in book 16 and 22 whether or not to save Sarpedon and Hector from death. And he ultimately decides against it. And let's explore this relationship between Zeus and fate a little bit more, because this is where people sort of tend to tie themselves up in knots, understandably so. So if we think of Zeus and fate, we know that Zeus, obviously, he knows more than the other gods. For example, he argues with Hera in book 1, when he tells Hera to stop supposing. He says, you're supposing. He says, stop supposing. I'm going to tell you, if I find it necessary for you to know what is happening with fate, I will tell you. Until then, leave me alone. He also reassures Thetis in book 1. Don't get this confused with the Aeneid, where in the Aeneid Jupiter obviously unscrolls the scroll of the fates. But we see in book 1 Zeus has this sort of higher understanding of fate than the other gods. And the other gods know that and sort of go to him seeking that information. We also see that he can clearly change the path that fate takes, although not the outcome of the war, because he allows the Trojans to win for a while, but he says, don't ask me to change to save Troy, because that's not going to happen, and that all happens in book 1 as well. Like I said, he considers saving those mortals such as Hector and Sarpedon. This suggests that he is able to intervene with mortals' fate, but he's not willing, because it would upset the other gods. And Hera gives this argument twice with both of these examples, where she says the rest of us gods will not approve, because then what if somebody else wants to save their favourite the next time? And the whole sort of power dynamic between gods and mortals would therefore disintegrate. And so actually it's in the gods' interest that mortals die and that mortals' fate becomes fulfilled. And actually the gods want to help them along that way. However, we obviously see that when it comes time for Hector to die, so he considers saving Hector, but actually when it comes down to it, he brings out those golden scales, right? And Hector's fate sinks down, which makes the event seem like it's out of his control. So even though he considered saving him, the golden scales say it's Hector's time, and so Zeus doesn't save him. There's also a moment in book 8, which obviously we don't read, in which Zeus brings out the scales and puts the Trojans and the Greeks in either side, and they tip in the Trojans' favour and allowing the Trojans to win, which suggests that these scales, which are sort of meant to represent fate, clearly in that point reflect Zeus's will, because Zeus decided in book 1 to let the Trojans win. In book 8 we see the scales reflecting that, and so there's this sort of confusion as to who's in control of those scales. Are they a reflection of fate? Are they a reflection of Zeus's will? And this is where I'm going to get to the crux of this issue, And the reason why a fate essay would really be so hard is these two questions. Is Zeus's relationship with fate consistent, and are they the same thing? Fate throughout the Iliad is not depicted as something that is consistent, and certainly not if you compare it to something like the Aeneid. It's not a consistent thing. The way that it behaves and it's the way it interacts with the other gods, with the mortals, with Zeus, is simply not consistent. At times, they seem to be the same thing. In the proem at the start of book 1, we're told that it's through the quarrel that the will of Zeus was fulfilled, thus the will of Zeus was fulfilled. As though his will and the fate of Troy are one and the same thing. At other times, such as with Sarpedon or in book 4 in the Council of the Gods, he seems to almost be resisting or playing with fate. And ultimately, this goes back to Jenkins's point from the previous slide. It's simply not relevant to Homer how fate behaves. He's not trying to explain fate. It is just another character hit to him in his story that will behave in whatever way tells the best story in the most emotional way. I think that to confuse Homer with a philosopher is incorrect. Homer is a poet, and therefore he will use fate and the gods and all other notions and devices and characters in the way that will best explain his story and best tell his story. Okay, so another way to look at the relationship between the gods and fate is through Emma Greensmith's quote that the gods' role is essentially to police fate onto the right path. And Homer does this and shows the power of the gods and the power of fate through his would-haves. Such as, and what do I mean by would-haves? So in book 3, for example, we see Menelaus and Paris dueling, and we get told that Menelaus would have killed Paris, would have dragged him off and won unutterable glory if Aphrodite hadn't intervened and saved Paris. We see it in book 16, we see that Patroclus, we get told he would have scaled the walls and brought Troy down then if Apollo hadn't intervened and pushed him back. And we see it very similarly with Achilles, that he would have taken Troy if Apollo hadn't intervened. And we see it again in this sort of silly little in the funeral games in a less serious way, where we get told that Diomedes would have won the chariot race if Apollo didn't strike the whip out of his hand. So all of these would-haves give us these glimpses of something that could have happened if the gods hadn't sort of nudged the mortals back onto the path that they should be on. And I'm going to summarize it like this, and I would probably suggest just writing it down and copying this word for word into your essay. But Homer gives us these insights into an alternate reality, but ultimately the power of the gods and the will of fate supersedes these potential actions of the mortals. So what it ultimately demonstrates is that the power of the gods and the will of fate is stronger and will always win. And they will often intersect. So what the will of the fate is and what the gods try and do, they intersect. So for example, in book 3, if Menelaus had killed Paris then, what would have happened to Hector? What would have happened to Achilles? What would have happened to Patroclus? All of these people who had this fate and this destiny wouldn't have been able to fulfill it. And that's why Aphrodite intervenes, because she cannot allow for Paris to die just then. She's got all of this other fate that she needs to make sure happens. These alternate realities, they're interesting. They give us, the audience, a sense of like a close call, which is exciting and intriguing. Homer sort of like very slightly props open a door so we can get a glimpse of what could have happened, and then he slams it in our face again, and that draws us in. Ultimately, you need to remember that this is a society that would go again and again to watch the theatre and to watch stories that they know the ending of. There would be loads of different stories of Oedipus or whatever, or the Bacchae, etc., etc. They would know what happens. There is no point at which a tragedy changes the ending. They're going because they want to see the story, and this story, this way of storytelling, using the fate and using the gods in this way, is interesting and engaging for the audience. the idea of fate and the idea of knowing the ending doesn't make a story less exciting. It makes it more exciting depending on how a poet uses such devices. So this is pretty much what I have to say, because this lesson is just designed to introduce how to think about fate if it comes up as an essay. I would still recommend, if fate came up as an essay, to answer the Aeneid question, whatever it is. Just answer the Aeneid question. You're probably going to do better on it. And if a free will and fate question comes up, run out of the example. Just give up right then. You're going to just tie yourself up in knots about predeterminism, whether Achilles made the choice to do X or Y or Z. Most people don't know how to discuss free will and fate in their own lives, let alone in a story, and support it with scholarly argument. So if free will and fate comes up, just run. Just tear the paper up and run. Not worth touching. Do not touch it with a barge pole. But if you want to write an essay about fate and how it is used as a device and how it interacts with the gods and how it interacts with mortals, remember to use Jenkins and Greensmith as the crux of your argument here. And you can argue against Ryu, who argued that he was a theologian and this was sort of how they thought about fate. Incorrect. Because if Homer wanted to explore how fate worked, he would make it better. He would make it more consistent and more explainable and more understandable. He didn't do that because it's only used when it's convenient for him. I'll leave you with this. If Homer wanted to tell us about fate and free will, he would, but he didn't. It's like Picasso. Picasso did not draw faces as they are normally seen. He drew them stylized. Can Picasso draw a face? Yes, he can. Could. Sorry, Picasso. It is not about ability. If Homer wanted to tell us about fate, if he had this brilliant philosophy, he could have written about that. Instead, what he's writing about is the tragedy of humanity, the tragedy of mankind, and fate is used to sort of explain the things that are out of our control, to explain the things that are out of human control and our sort of very limited mortality. And that's why fate and death are often conflated. This idea that Achilles chose his fate, where he's chosen his death. And so that is the thing that Homer wants to write about. And that's where we see, in book 17, we see Zeus crying over the horses and lamenting about how terrible mankind is. It's why the very last story in book 24 that the mortals talk about is Achilles talking about how you're sort of dealt the good and the bad and you don't have control over that. And, you never really know how lucky you are until it's all over and you're dead. So that's a bleak ending. And maybe don't write that in your essay. But this is why I think it's important to avoid a fate essay and to understand it as a poetic device, because Homer's not a philosopher. He's a poet and he wanted to create something artistic and intriguing and entertaining. And that's where I talk about highest scoring essays, think more widely and from a sort of distance point of view in terms of the function of devices and the function of characters and what the artist's intention might be. Hope I haven't confused you more. Let me know in the comments if I have and I'll just delete the video. Fate's horrible.